Alrighty, good evening, everyone. This week I'm discussing globalization, poverty, and inequality in reference to Mexican women in Juarez on the Global Assembly Line and the Maquila women working in maquiladoras in Tijuana, Mexico, or Maquilapolis. Since the 1980s, globalization has become a more prominent ideology, leading to economic neoliberal globalized policies being pushed by Western superpowers and their international institutions upon countries in Latin America and Africa who had been previously colonized. These were the structural adjustment loans that were initially seen as providing development aid in the 1980s and 1990s, with huge helping hands from the IMF and World Bank. They said that as long as they followed the DLP formula posited by Steger and Roy, it would be feasible and create economic sustainability in these developing countries. The DLP formula consists of deregulation of the economy, liberalization of the trade industry, and privatization of state-owned enterprises. It's clear that these neoliberal policies, backed by the movement of globalization ideology, made the richer rich and the poorer poor. From Peru to Ghana, from Mexico to Brazil, globalization has changed the way scholars perceive poverty and inequality. Many scholars can argue pros and cons from the knock-on effects of globalization and can argue the benefit of NAFTA or the EU. This case report will take a look at the maquiladora lifestyle and the maquila woman in Mexico's textile and clothing plant industries to empirically identify how globalization has affected poverty and inequality of these women through wage changes, working conditions, discrimination, increased violence, and the commodification of these women in this industry of work. Also, the invention of, of offshoring to minimize one country's loss while maximizing another country's exploitation. The concept of maquiladoras went into effect before globalization via a USA-Mexico treaties in the 1960s to mass assemble and produce in maquiladoras and then export it to the US and other country consumers. In the documentary movie Maquilapolis, some of the hurdles in these women's lives have been created by the spread of globalization, leading to increased poverty and inequality. This movie follows a couple of Maquila women working in maquiladoras in the city of factories in Tijuana, Mexico. It follows their lives and working conditions and their progression to activists. Here, they deal with foreign companies bringing their factories over for tax breaks and cheap labor, incentivized by globalization. These multinational companies could pay workers less than in their own countries while making more, and often still at increased wage income in the factory hosting countries. An example of an SAP would be agricultural reform to help stimulate the economy. This was based on globalized neoliberal policies like deregulating markets and promoting more free trade on a global level, as mentioned earlier. Some of these reforms have backfired, leading to increased unemployment in rural areas. Offshoring is an example of neoliberal policies enacted by globalization. When multinational conglomerates and corporations move their wealth to a different country, they legally can move their companies in order to avoid paying taxes that benefit the people working for them. With all these foreign-owned assembly plants that make up the maquiladoras, they induce taxation intentionally. This does sometimes allow them to pay the workers higher wages, for example, the maquila women, although this is at the cost of poor treatment, poor working conditions, discrimination, and inequality, all seen with the maquilas. Global capitalism requires the centralization of labor in global cities in the third and first worlds. Structural adjustment policies in Mexico have forced migrations of laborers from rural areas to export processing zones. In the documentary, one of the maquilas, Lourdes, discusses the chemical runoff in the area and the increase in people with diseases, disabilities, and other healthcare problems, probably due to the environmental filth and lack of laws or policies enforced or in place to protect these women from these working and living conditions. Hendricks and Haggard discuss the importance of attitude towards environmental policy and climate change and how they play a role in economic conditions affecting the price of food in developing countries, from accessibility to affordability. The Maquila women would agree with them that more environmental awareness and protection is needed to also protect people in developing countries from disease, and more, rather than leaving them to be exploited by globalization and offshoring, which also then increases inequality, if not additionally domestic poverty. This case report is following these women specifically due to the exploitation and violence they're affected by due to the globalization and liberalization of trade. Within globalization, a woman factory worker is seen as a commodity. Subsequently, if the commodity isn't efficient or worth something, it doesn't fit into the neoliberal scheme of globalization. So then, if a worker protests exploitations or poor working conditions or discrimination, they are let go while the big company looks for the next new commodity that will be productive. Especially as a woman, data shows largely from Livingston's Murder in Juarez and also from documentary Maquila and this week's readings that women have been exploited more than men by globalization via poverty and inequality, from different wages, discrimination, sexual harassment, sexual violence, and more. In the readings this week, David Dollar discusses 5 trends born from globalization, including that inequality had generally decreased due to globalization. This has been contested and refuted by many scholars since, and many agree that poverty and inequality may not be the same, but are both crucial to protect and further prevent while increasing economic growth and sustainability. This case report partially supports some of Dollar's claims this week about the positives of globalization, although it empirically focuses more on exploitation and violence of the Maquila women due to globalization, and highlights how their gender plays a role in their poverty and inequality as well. Livingston's piece identifies the exploitation, discrimination, inequality, and sexual violence experienced by women in the global assembly line, created by globalization and increased world free trade. Placed in Juarez, Mexico, not far from the Maquila, she focuses on 9 months in 1998, where there were over 800 cases of rape and 9,000 cases of violence, including rape, kidnapping, and domestic violence. Circling back to the Maquila women, the reason women worked in the clothing garment factory industries at such a larger percentage of men was because some women saw this as a positive of globalization. The ability to secure their own autonomy and agency, social independence, and financial control and freedom. They struck out on their own to work in these factories for their own wages and live their own lives. However, the corporations exploited and took advantage of this, hiring women because they had smaller, daintier hands for factory equipment and had more patience for monotonous, boring work and long hours, according to the documentary Maquila. The maquiladores draw on local patriarchal practices, discourse, and tolerance of sexual violence against women, and thus violence against women has intensified. While globalization may have contributed some positive trends as posited by Dollar, the issue of the maquilador women and maquilador women and women in the global assembly line and globalized factory industry have been exploited due to globalization's neoliberal policies, making the richer rich and the poorer poor. The Maquila women are fighting against inequality in the workforce, poor working and living conditions, sexual violence, and the commodification of them as human beings in the face of globalization. They're doing this through a group called Promotora, Promotora. New infrastructure and theoretical framework is needed by international institutions, and cross-national cooperation is required to enforce these domestically and internationally to create sustainable, positive economic growth worldwide. Many of the authors agreed this week, again, that cross-national cooperation is important.